Thank you for coming to this talk. Base outline is going to be delivering your vision. So you're all well acquainted. These are my primary objectives, the main things I want to touch on today. So I want to touch on when you're delivering other people's visions or projects, and it spans a couple of ideas. So the idea of working with licensed properties, the idea of working with other properties which wouldn't be considered a standard license. Things like if you're working with car brands was a really good example I was talking to someone about yesterday. And also if you're working with, say, an art director or something like that who has a very clearly defined art bible or vision for a game, it has a lot of similarities. So what we're going to be looking at is preparation. I think this is probably one of the biggest things, especially if you're pitching or going through and setting up a project like this, is making sure that you've got all your assets and everything like that ready to go, and that you're asking the right questions with whoever you're working with around that. As well as that, opportunities, because from my perspective, I think a lot of people, if they're working on new IP and stuff like that, it's really exciting. You can do whatever you want. There's a certain apprehension towards working with either someone else's idea or working with someone who's got a very clear vision for that kind of stuff. Now, from my perspective, those limitations can actually give you some really great opportunities. So I want to kind of touch on what some of those could be, and also some questions that if you're in other roles on a team, if you're a producer, if you're narrative or something like that, there are ways that you can maybe kind of squeeze some great ideas out of that. And then thirdly, this idea of communicating your vision. So if you're creating a new IP, if you're working on kind of an existing franchise or something like that, how do you package up what you've got, or what are the major kind of points of interest that you need to put together to actually supply someone else that might be working on something? So from my perspective, that's something where a lot of people really mess up a bit, and in the current space, we've got a lot of indies in Australia, of course, we've got a lot of smaller studios, and often we'll have content, we always underestimate what could happen with our properties or titles. The idea of something actually being successful, as much as we all hope for it, we don't necessarily plan for that. And I think there's been some really good talks from people just going through and trying to organize around that and prepare for success. And I think that's a really good one for a brand. Think of what your property might be and how you could actually supply it to someone else to work on. So, who am I? My name's Dean. I do art stuff for video games. I've been working in the industry for over 10 years now. Back in the day when I worked with a couple of people in this room, I was up in Brisbane working at Chrome Studios, worked on some Star Wars titles, so Force Unleashed back in the day, that was some PS2 stuff. Worked on Clone Wars, things like that when I was with Chrome. More recently, I was doing some other Star Wars projects. This is just personal work. But I've worked in environment, I've worked in characters as a principal artist as well. And so I've kind of worked across areas on projects. More recently, I was working with 2K Australia, where I got to work on Borderlands the Pre-Sequel. So this was another one where, again, it was an existing property, Gearbox software, of course, doing Borderlands 1 and 2. And at 2K Australia, we got to do the Pre-Sequel, along with a couple of levels were also handled by Gearbox and the like. So this was another one where, again, a very stylized game, very specific vision, but we had to match it. But on the moon, where everyone spoke like Australians for some reason. And I also did the DLC for it, which is going to be something that I touch on, because that was something where we did quite different things with what was the Borderlands franchise. Currently, I'm working on this. It has yet to be announced. Ryan, who's in the office, is also working on that. So currently, I'm with Manchu, which is a very small team in Canberra, but we also have some people in Canada, and we've got some people in England, and we're a little bit spread out. So I'm working with them, and I do a little bit of everything on the art side of things. So I'm doing technical art, I'm doing 3D art, and it's a very interesting project, so hopefully I'll be able to talk about that soon, but not right now. But this idea of this talk actually came up when I first started with this team, so I've been working with them for a couple of years now. And the art director, who used to work at 2K as well, everyone at the team mostly worked at 2K at some stage. The art director and I, we were talking about, this is when I was just starting to kind of look at working on their current project. He's got a very specific vision. And one of the things when he was talking to me was looking at my history of what have I worked on. And that's when I actually realized that every single title I've worked on over the years, and I've worked on a lot of cancelled projects, as well as the ones that I've shipped. So as well as all the Star Wars and all the Borderlands and all these other NDA ones, every single project has been pretty stylized visually. It hasn't been a traditional kind of visual game. It's all been based on a license of some variety. And I've been having to deal with these things repeatedly. And so even with this current project, it's a new IP, but our art director has a very specific approach. So part of his thing was like, can you match this? And it did get me thinking about, all right, how does this work then? Some of the considerations we have to have about what we can do with our current game and how we can package up art and make that clearly understandable to other people. And part of that was also, we had a junior join our team doing art. What do we need to supply for them so that they can match our art production standards and look? And a lot of it's a little bit more high level than kind of practicalities, because it's around how you communicate these things. So basic historical context, which I think is kind of important for these things. When I started, which was a fair few years ago, things were very different. I studied 3D art, and my expectation was that I would come out of study and I would go and work on what at the time seemed like a very standardized pipeline. Most console games kind of looked a bit the same. The 3D art production pipeline was a bit of hand painting, a bit of photo reference for those hand painted textures, and pretty uniform lighting systems across the board. And I kind of thought that might be the case. Before I even started studying, Wind Waker did come out. And Wind Waker was a really interesting one because there were lots of very stylized games already out in the market. There's always been really fascinatingly beautiful games that capture people's imaginations, and they talk about them, and they've been very successful for that reason. They're always there. But at the time, which was kind of 15 years ago, it did feel like there was a lot of brown, a lot of standard 3D stuff. People weren't really exploring these things. And Wind Waker was a really big existing franchise, which had a drastic visual change. And it was pretty negatively received by some people. But it was really positive in other areas. And I think from my perspective, I saw opportunities that weren't there prior. So even when I was going into the industry, I assumed I'd be doing stuff that looked like Quake or Unreal Tournament, which was quite colorful still, but everything was around that one pipeline and that one approach to art. So as much as I wanted to be working on a Katamari or an Oddworld game, which is what I'd kind of come up wanting to be a part of, and I figured I'd already missed Grim Fandango. I wasn't going to be able to work on a cool game like that. But I figured the landscape was getting a little bit more homogenous. But it's really great now, and I think this is just a slate of like relatively recent games that I grabbed, all of them based on some licensed property, or like with Cuphead and Obra Dinn, they're titles which are incredibly stylized and paying homage to an established art style. They've taken something and they're still trying to match that very specific value. And it works great. Like, there's a reason people talk about them. And you can see the other licensed properties are fantastic, the games that people are actually playing now. When I started, there was such negativity around licensed properties. And I think a lot of that was just because we were pumping things out really quickly. It wasn't to a high degree. And what's happened over the industry is as it's contracted, we've had a greater focus on quality. That quality translates to licensed properties as well. So there's no reason not to. But at the same time, something like Cuphead and Obra Dinn, they can become their own entities as well. And Obra Dinn, not necessarily the same merchandising options as Cuphead probably. Cuphead, you can buy freaking anything with Cuphead on it now. But it's still, it's a real love letter to that Mac gaming era. So, first and foremost, this is the actual kind of stuff that is important. Might seem really straightforward, but whose vision are you actually trying to translate? If you're working with a really big licensed entity and stuff like that, it can be pretty daunting because really, really big behemoth corporations, you're not going to be dealing with just one person. You're going to be dealing with marketing departments, you're going to have sign-off and stuff like that. It's really important that the entire team actually understands how that functions. I've been on teams where there's just this nebulous idea of what's going on, of like, oh, we make this car and we send it off and someone tells us just before we're about to ship that the car can't be used because it's got the wrong badge on it or something like that from the car company, or from the latest Marvel movie is like, no, you can't, we've got to deal with Ford now, you have to change this. That can build resentment in a team because you've got this weird kind of hierarchical structure which people don't understand. So I think exposing that's really good, and it means that art directors and things like that have a way to manage that. I've worked as a lead, I've worked as kind of in an actual production roles. Producers, all those people are going to make everyone's lives so easy with this kind of stuff. But communication about who's involved is really great. And if it's a creator who is still alive, try and see if you actually have a direct line of communication with them. They might be too busy. Generally, if you're working on a licensed property or something like that, it's being farmed out for a reason. They don't have scope and ability to handle that stuff internally. But they still might want to have oversight. And there have been some projects where we've been involved with something and someone quite higher up just was never told or was never checked in on. And they then come in later down the track and they're like, oh, I'm really interested in this now. Like, I can help you. It would have been great at the start. So make a clear line as to who you're actually doing this for and who has say, because everyone tries to have say. Art Bibles and reference. Has anyone had like a brand book that they've gotten or an art Bible from a license holder? It's pretty dense, but also, depending who you're working with, it can be really detailed down to color codes for everything that you need to do. Generally, if it's someone working with more of an established brand where it has had marketing presence, then they understand how to do that stuff. And as a result, they're probably more hands-on with saying, no, that's the wrong blue. If you're working with someone who hasn't done that yet, then it's much more nebulous, and they're only realizing those things when they've handed something over to you and they're like, oh, we didn't think about that. Yes, can you change this, blah, blah. So sometimes it's good to also just push back on some of those things and just clarify early on. Because if it's quite broad what they've given you, that doesn't necessarily mean that you've got a lot of freedom. It just means that they haven't considered what those freedoms might be. So you can kind of check those things early on. It's an interesting thing as well, because on really big projects, you assume that it's going to be really well organized. Sometimes the bigger it is, the less organized it is, because they take it for granted as well. So just check those things. And again, if you're creating your own, if you're working on your own project, document these things when you get started. Because, like I said, if you do find success, if the need does arise at some point, then you want to have that stuff ready. Now, I know and I'm horrible at this, I start off really, really well at the start of a project. It kind of tapers off as you're actually having to get stuff ready to ship, and there's not as much documentation at that point in a project. So it's a good reminder, if you are in those later stages and you do have some spare time, go back and kind of put together some, or update some of those earlier documents as well, based on some of those findings that you've had throughout production, because it will shift and change. So with some of those things, and with a lot of projects that I've worked on, some of them you will get documents like production documents. So it will be things like texturing guides, something that in the first 3 months of a project, you're like, we need to let everyone on the team know how we're going to texture assets. So we're going to do up a 3-page PDF, which shows that texturing process. And we'll do that and get everyone upskilled, ready at the start of the project. That then becomes the only thing that references that at all throughout the rest of that project. By the end of it, what they're shipping has they've changed this and they're doing different line work here, or they're using something like a substance pipeline to generate textures. But all of that additional information has to be recommunicated on top of what is a very simple PDF. So yeah, try and avoid that or update it. Organize. So if something is a really, really big project, I think this is a fun one as well, where you can get multiple people involved. Unfortunately, on certain projects, this often falls to production assistants, sometimes to art roles and art leads and stuff like that. But it should be, I think there's value in getting everyone, so even programmers and stuff like that involved. I know on some of the really great projects where we have been going through and doing that organizing phase, it's a great collaborative effort where you can get everyone aware of what the project should be. It means that even things like if you've got your testing departments and stuff like that, they're actually going to be aware of things to pick up, because if they've had to be involved with sorting documents and you've all been discussing it together, they'll know that that's the wrong blue. It is, a sharing of knowledge is really valuable for these things, and sometimes I think people just don't see the value of discussing with other departments. So, rank it. With really big projects as well, everything that you get for reference might not be relevant. A good example is Star Wars. So doing Star Wars stuff, the Ewok movies aren't really great for reference because at the time they weren't considered canon. It's the same with a lot of things. If you're working with a property which has been around for years, if you're doing stuff with Disney or something like that, they're going to have pretty heavy considerations about what is and isn't something that they want to refer to now, because they've got far too many years of media that they probably don't want to acknowledge. It's a different time. So be aware of things like this, and I think there was a really interesting thing with like a big brand like Star Wars. It, rather than just this is relevant, this isn't relevant, it was this ranking of, if this is relevant, then it supersedes this element, which could also be relevant. So there's a hierarchy which people on the team understand. And again, this is going to save you production time if everyone's aware of these things, because you can find out things of, is that something that that character should be doing, or that costume is incorrect. How should I adjust it and set it up? So what I was briefly discussing before was this idea of communication, and there are some interesting ways to do it. I think everyone's incredibly apprehensive, especially about wasting programmers' time, because programmers are very valuable people and they're so skilled, and at the end of the day, they want to be involved with things as well. I think there are ways, especially when you are communicating an idea or a brand or something like that. One of the projects I worked on, we had a really cool thing where they don't have to sort through all of the documents, but you know what? Everyone gets together and watches a movie, which the project is based on or something like that. It's an hour to 2 hours of everyone's time, maybe have a quick discussion at the end of it, but the fact that they're aware, a little bit more aware of what's going on, means that if they're implementing things, following design docs, there's going to be a better understanding. It also goes to things like pitching, because at the pitching stage, if everyone knows what they're pitching for, you're going to have a better quality pitch. You're going to be able to respond to what that is important about that brand, but also important about the art, things like that. You can find ways to make the most of it. So, breakdowns. This is an interesting approach where if anyone's worked on pitching their own projects, is anyone familiar with the term like key pillars or key selling points for a game pitch? Yeah. So we're pretty familiar with this idea of rather than saying this game has 50 cool things you can do, we say, here are the 3 really important things about this game, because that's what people have time for. And so why not do the same when you're looking at someone else's property? They might not do it for you. Sometimes they will. Sometimes they'll say, this is why this game is really important. Other times, though, go into it and say, what speaks to me about this? What do we need to retain from this world? I mean, Star Wars is a good example where the worlds are actually really important touchstones, the creatures, the fantasy of it all. These are things that you want to keep when you're building something which references it and works on that, the brilliance of whatever project you're able to be somewhat adjacent to. So what I kind of like about this idea is taking those key pillars for a game, those key selling points, key aspects, and actually applying them across all aspects of what makes a game. Because if you're working with something outside of games, or outside of interactive media as well, then a film, the key selling points for a film aren't relevant in the same way for what you're doing for interactive media. And from an art approach and an art perspective, which is what I'm generally thinking about, how can you modify or change these things to work for what you've got planned? So things like animation, camera is so important, and there are ways that you can deliver a feeling or a vibe for a product by just matching the camera or giving things like camera edits and cuts. Again, something everyone can think of, like the wipes and fades that something like Star Wars does. So that's something which, you're going to want to put into your game as well if you're making a game based on that. These are areas where artists are often expected, or creators on the team are expected to come up with their own ideas for some of these things. It's really good for everyone to kind of, especially during an ideation phase, to think about what kind of things can we do. And nothing should be off limit when you're early on in production or pitching or planning. And I think the lesson from the past, and this is projects that I've been on and projects that I've seen, is people generally play it very safe. I think now with the really crowded marketplace, there's more than ever a real benefit to doing something which stands out, something which is unique. You kind of need to. It's one of our perspectives at Blue Manchu, is the idea that if you see a screenshot for one of our games, you should immediately be able to tell what game it is. It's a simple marketing perspective. In the same way, look at ways that if you are working with a licensed product, what can you do which embodies what it's about? A really cool example would actually be with animation. So not a licensed property, but Double Fine did this prototype that never went into full production called Brazen, which was more or less a Monster Hunter clone being done by Double Fine for their animation system, and the game was really trying to capture a Ray Harryhausen vibe. So stop motion animation, monsters, and all this kind of stuff. And it had hand-painted textures. They built this demo in a very short period of time. One of the things which really stood out for it, and they had trailers and stuff, and they had a demo that you could get on Steam as well. One of the great things was the animation. They made it look like stop motion, and they actually animated it naturally. And I believe from memory they used compression. So they pretty much just cranked the compression up on the FBX for the exported animation. But it gave it this really stop motion vibe, and it looked really, really cool. That's one thing. One little thing. The rest of if you had the rest of the game being shown without that, you wouldn't have immediately had that association that it was Ray Harryhausen kind of stuff. So taking those key aspects of whatever property you're looking at, you can apply them and see how can we recreate this within the framework, which is games. And as someone who does a lot of tech art, things like shaders, awesome. You can do so much stuff, and I think people really just underestimate the benefit to exploring these things. So one of my lessons of areas where things have not gone as I intended has been, at the end of the day, for any interactive media and games especially, the most important thing is the game. I think most people would probably talk about the fact that you can have a game that looks really pretty, but if it doesn't play well, most people aren't going to really care. So it has to be in service of what that experience is. A good example for this was, so I worked on Clone Wars, or I worked on a Clone Wars game. And Clone Wars was, I think the first season had aired. We got access to a lot of their assets, things like that, and we were producing it. And the main idea was that we were going to make it look like the show. So we got fairly close on some of the environment stuff. There was engine things. It was an early in that generation, so lots of things I would have liked to have done differently. But the idea for it was to kind of make a game which everyone can play with your kids and stuff. Lego Star Wars had come out just prior. It had been pretty successful, and it was a similar set of mechanics, jumping around, fixed camera. And so the pitch for it had this fixed camera. It had worked in other games, but with this art style of Clone Wars, Clone Wars has very skinny, long characters. When you've got a fixed camera which is really pulled out, it actually doesn't work great for platformers. And it's just something we were working around, and it was serviceable, but it didn't really work in service of what that product was. And I think there's a really kind of good lesson to take from these things early on, where you actually should interrogate these ideas. Lego Star Wars worked really well because Lego minifigs look like a platformer character. They're a squat little square on your screen, and you'll notice most platform like games which have fixed camera pulled out have a squat little square character. So it works. For this, it didn't really work in service of what the actual gameplay was. So implementation, when you are putting these things in, you should be interrogating the ideas, seeing what works and what doesn't. And just from my perspective, the best projects I have been on have had a purpose. They've had an outline from the get-go as to why that product should be a platformer, why that should be an FPS. Something like Borderlands the pre-sequel. There was a reason for it, that people were wanting that content, and there was a story to tell there. Visually, we could kind of take elements from both, but also have something new as well. So from that basis with Borderlands, we did the DLC. The DLC was a great opportunity because I think it hits a lot of these ideas, which I like, where we had a property, we'd worked with it, we'd done some stuff for it. The DLC was set in Claptrap's mind. So it was this big fantasy digital world, Tron style. You go into Claptrap and you have all these levels. It gave us so much creative freedom because none of this had been done before at all in any of their games. We could do something like this, so this was one of the areas I designed and did all of the art for. And we could kind of go wild. But it was existing in that universe, it was working with what was there, but we were expanding upon it. And I think that's a really key thing, because if you can do that with a property where you can do the iPhone game for whatever that console game was, maybe there's a reason to do a mobile game rather than just a direct rip of like some of the interesting missions or something from it. Make it around what people want to experience, or expand on some of the lore in that game. There's a lot of avenues, and I think especially if you're pitching and you do pitch something a little bit out of the box, generally, again, it will be listened to by the property holders. It's not going to be similar to other pitches. And yeah, the Claptastic Voyage, this was all the subconscious levels. Got to do crazy cool MC Escher spaces, got to play with perspective, things like that. It was something where we had a lot of flexibility, and so we were able to really push it out. It was lots of fun, and it was really well received. It was better received than the rest of the game because it was really pushing it in a interesting and strange new direction. So, when you're doing these things, in regards to getting them set up in game, testing, things like that, once you are actually in production, and this is also especially if you're working with having to deliver milestones to publishers and stuff, it's very tough. I think that, so there's one takeaway that I have. If you're working with clients, there's two types of clients. Clients that work in your industry and clients that work outside of your industry. Clients that work in your industry can be painful in all their own ways, but at least they understand what you do. Clients that work outside of it, and one of the examples I was talking with someone about yesterday was working with a car company. They were doing a car game, and a day before they've got a release, they get feedback from the car company saying, you've got to change this. They didn't understand that that's not something you just like tick the box and you send out the new build. But they wanted it right then and there. Different clients will have different focuses, so you need to make sure that when you're supplying things that they can see what's going on. Now, we've got this way of talking about in the office as well when we are showing new things in a game. And it's something which I didn't have as much experience with on a big team because you've generally got so many people, everyone can work on everything at once, and you'll get an asset which has all the animations, all the audio, all the texturing, all that kind of stuff delivered at the same time in game. When you've got a small team, you've got all these bottlenecks because you've only got a couple of people working on everything. And so we refer to it as heavy lifting. Sometimes something will do the heavy lifting for an asset or an implemented feature. And that could be, like an example would be like you've got a container that you can open and you can get treasure out of it or something. You might have that asset in and it might have the animation playing. It's got the bare essential things to it. Someone's using it and they're like, oh, this doesn't feel right. We need more, maybe make the animation have a little bit more pop and a little bit more bounce. And you spend a day, 2 days trying to fix this animation side of it. Well, what it's missing might be kind of an actual particle effect, it might be the audio, it might be UI, you might actually need a UI element. The heavy lifting and the balance and focus for this concept is you want to make sure that you've got a lot of those things in before you're assessing them. And that's kind of basic, but it's really, really important when you're dealing with other people because especially when they're clients from outside industry, they're not going to understand how it comes together. And anyone who's worked on games, they look but ugly until they ship pretty much. I think most projects I've worked on, they're not great. And the number of people who have come in from outside industry and they're looking at a game in development and they're like, oh God, we've made a horrible mistake. This is not going to end the way that we expected. And then you get 3 months to ship and they're like, oh wow, it looks really good now. Grey box. Oh, that's all gone. So something like this, we were trying to do different stuff with Borderlands. So supplying stuff and saying, yeah, we know what Borderlands is, but we think we can do this thing where we've got boxes which vibrate in the air and we've got like glowing stuff and I'm going to put pools on the wall and it will be fine, it will be okay. Sometimes you have to be mindful how you present that to other people and especially clients. We were really lucky because we're working with other game devs, so they know how this goes. They're like, that's fine. Yeah, we've done crazier stuff. Like that's okay, but you definitely have to know who you're talking to about these things. And yeah, when you are playing with so this was a really cool one where even this element came out of a discussion when in a meeting where we were talking about what we could do with this kind of thing. We were just talking about what technology we kind of had access to with shaders and things like that. Someone proposed the idea that we could do a shader which just kind of blocked out and rendered the sky dome wherever we wanted. So this entire level has, on the left you can see like there's a whole level behind that door, but you can't see it. So that was like a little tech thing where we're like, wow, cool, we can build this. It would be really neat, and it really fit with what that brand was and what we could explore with it. And it really messed with people's minds. So it was great. So yeah, if you've got a brand that you're working with and you're talking to the stakeholders about it and you're trying to plan what's going on, always poke just to be like, so how flexible are you? What can we get away with? Because there will be limitations, but it's good to know what those limitations are to start with, because if you're pitching things like that, being able to say, we really like that FPS game, we want to do the driving game for the mobile version of it or something like that, well, you need to find out if that's something that they would be interested in. And sometimes it will be great, like if they're really flexible, you can do something drastically different and work to the strengths of the platform that you're working on. If you're doing a mobile game for a AAA console title, guess what? Making it look exactly like that console experience probably isn't right. It's a different screen, it's a different interaction thing. Work to your platform and stuff, but see how flexible they are. They might be completely 100% behind that, and if you don't ask, then it's not going to happen. So there's a couple of ideas with this where you really do, from my perspective, biggest regrets I have is not making stuff which has been different enough or has stood out. Something like Borderlands is great because I can point back at that now and be like, yeah, we did something quite unique. It wasn't what was already there. Whereas other things, it's like, yeah, it looked exactly like the show. That's great if you can do that. But it's not memorable. And I think the entire game experience, if you can get that out, is great. Where if you can make the entire thing special, do it. Look at opportunities and see what the end experience should be, because that should dictate what the product is. I think people kind of forget that recently with different games that I've seen. This is one of my favorite examples recently of people taking some licensed stuff. I'm not sure if anyone's played the Go series of games from Square Enix, and they've more or less been using a lot of the IDOS properties. But they're really clever mobile games. They're great mobile games. They look nothing like the properties that they're based on. But each and every one of them touches on those memorable or key selling points of those titles, both in the interaction with these games, in the art style as well, even something like Lara Croft Go, which is very minimalist and stuff like that. Guess what? It's got Lara Croft in it, because you can't make a Tomb Raider game without Lara Croft. That's kind of what I'm getting at with some of these key points. You can then take a couple of those key elements and build an interesting experience around that, both art and interaction-wise. And yeah, if you tried to do just a photorealistic Tomb Raider game on a mobile, it probably wouldn't be as interesting, probably would not run very well. So teams in general, and I think the major benefit that I've seen over the years with this is we have developed a much better literacy to discuss these things. Like I was saying early on when I was talking about the historical context for these things, when I was starting, there just wasn't examples of what you could do. Now everyone can Google image search. When I started, YouTube wasn't a thing yet, so YouTube only came in afterwards. We were scraping things like GameTrailers.com to try and find examples of other games that had done something stylized and saying, oh, that's cool, that's got a toon shader, let's do something like that. Now we've got this literacy where we're all talking about it. We've got Twitter, we can share a technique, you can see someone who's done a new shader for Unity, you can message them, they can send it through to you. If you're in a meeting, you've got a producer who might not have any art background whatsoever, but they're coming to you with a tweet going, I saw this really cool game, and it's got this really cool shader, because they know what a shader is now, and when I started, not everyone did, and you're able to discuss these things in a much more open fashion, which I think is great. And I think this is why we're seeing better games now as well in this regard, because there's all these examples that we can kind of point to and build something around. So please keep doing that. So just to recap, preparation. Make sure you get all this stuff in before you actually get the ball rolling, because it's too late after you're already on the project. After you've already pitched something as well. I mean, the number of times, and this is where it comes to, you build yourself into a corner. If you pitch a game which is not very interesting, and then a publisher or a license holder is like, great, let's make that, then you got to make it. And it might not be that good. So early on, really interrogate those ideas. Make sure that you've got as much information that you're going to need. Make sure that you've got the assets that are going to make it possible, or that you can get access to them. Some things like Star Wars was great because they'd give you source content for things. But other projects that I know, friends that have worked on, they've more or less got nothing. They're like, no, we won't send that stuff through. We won't send you the source files. So I've seen people get Google image searches of the property they're working on and reverse engineer something to look exactly like that Google image search, because they're like, oh, I need to get this done for tomorrow. But I haven't, and it would take 5 seconds if they would just send me this thing, but it's not going to happen. So prepare those things. Look for opportunities where you can actually make something quite memorable. Look for something and discuss it. It doesn't have to be a 3D game. You can have a 3D game with 2D characters in it if it fits your pipeline or if it fits the brand. If you're working with something like a 2D animated Disney show or something, guess what? Try and you could actually rotoscope 2D characters and put them into a 3D world. You could do that for a mobile game, things like that. I don't think people are sometimes not brave enough. It's a risky thing if people haven't done it, and there's always going to be an aversion to risk when we're working on titles which other people are funding. But there's some really good opportunities there, which I think, again, if you're pitching, can also make your pitch stand out. And then if you're doing all these things yourself, if you're making your new IP, make sure you bundle that stuff together. Make sure you have a really cohesive art Bible available, because that game that you've just worked on might be the next Cuphead. It might be the next kind of huge franchise which has all this merchandising stuff. You might have to go on and work on the sequel. Meanwhile, guess what? They want a TV show done. They want a film done, things like that. Get it done while you're actually working on it. And also, it's just worst case scenario. If you break your hand, then you can't work on it. And we know that with our small team, we've got so many people so heavily invested in those areas. We've got to write something down in case I don't go into work tomorrow. So it's just really important to make sure that you've got all of that there and see the opportunities when you're presenting that vision. So that's more or less the main points I wanted to touch on. But if anyone's got any questions, please go ahead. Thank you. Any questions? Any experiences that people have had working with licensed properties that they would like to lament over or share? Yes?
I was wondering, getting content from the clients that you're working with.
Yep.
How do you work around, sometimes if they're not prepared to give that stuff, if they're just not prepared, they don't have it together, but they want it next week. How do you work around getting those sort of things?
You Google image search and then you reverse engineer it from that. You have to do whatever you can. So often people are within limited means with these things if you've got time frames. That's why it's best to do it as early as possible. I think it's really valuable to ask for more than you need, just because, worst case scenario, because you can avoid that as well. It's good for a client or a property holder in that regard to think about everything they have available. Sometimes they just won't think that something's useful. And I actually find it really valuable to know the thought process that got them to their final point. So they might have an art Bible or something like that. It's still, if you can even get ideations or concepts that led them to that stage, it's really valuable because you can fill in the blanks as well. Because if you have all this content that explains how they've designed their characters and it explains how they've designed their ZBrush pipeline or something like that for high poly and their sculpting techniques, and you can see things that they might have tried that didn't work, or they might have notes about it of like, yeah, we did try using substance, but there's a reason we didn't go with it. Then if there's something else that you're missing those pieces for, so you're missing another pipeline, you can recreate it through the evidence that you have, which I've found quite valuable on different projects where, say, they haven't supplied something like vehicles, but you've got architectural pipeline. You can apply it to something else. So, any other questions? No? Wait.
One on, maybe it's like a flip question. Any advice on, so right now we're working on a game concept that would directly relate to one license, and we've been asked to not make it about that license. Right?
Yep.
To find what are the opportunities and what are strategies that we can use to not be like another very iconic license.
I mean, it's the same thing of like, rather than focusing on the things that you want to be, you focus on the things that you don't want to be. So looking at the key aspects or the key selling points of that other license, using that as almost like the billboard thing of like, these are the things not to do, or these are the things that we like. You can start saying we want to be the polar opposite of these 3 points, or we want to at least appear as the polar opposite of these 3 points. I think that's a pretty interesting way to start going through that process, but it's is that their reasoning? They want to avoid something else, or
Yeah, so just another license that is very iconic and we don't want to be paired up with that.
yes, yeah. No, I think that's a fair thing to kind of just have those points to avoid. Yeah, that's, I guess, the easiest thing. I don't know. I've never been in that position, but it's a special one. Oh, yep.
Yes. When you're in a team working on a greater project, how many times do you have to meet, maybe a week or every couple of weeks, to ensure that what the team is doing is not falling outside what the license IP is?
Yep. Generally, with an art director and an art team and your production team, your art team's always, you're doing your constant check-ins anyway for all of your work. In terms of checking if it fits within the realm of the license that you've set out to work with, it varies for projects, but I think it's a pretty regular thing. So I think generally on a weekly basis, if you're getting builds and the like together, you're reviewing how it fits into the broader context of things in terms of how that's communicated to license holders to make sure that you don't get last minute dings that kind of delay you. Generally a standard milestone structure. If there's something that's quite sensitive though that you're not sure about, that's a great opportunity to try and set up a really regular back and forth if you can. Because if there's something which they're like sensitive about and want to see regular updates for, sometimes you don't want to show regular updates if that's going to confuse them. If they're one of those clients who is going to respond to every single feedback of like, no, this is right, no, this is wrong. Like you might want to create a little bit more breathing room between those updates. But yeah, some projects we've been almost in daily communication for certain aspects. Like for a week, you might have daily communication of like, we're doing this and you're getting sign off each day. But it comes availability wise, mostly, I think most license holders are more than happy to do it at milestones, which is great, but it means you get a lot of feedback notes at that one point. So you just get it all dumped on your lap and you have to distribute it with your team in one go. But I think most people prefer to just do a single big thing every kind of month, 2 months, but project dependent. Any other questions? Yep.
What do you think are the most important traits for a creative director to have?
Creative director, so not art director, just creative on a team.
Probably both.
Yep.
On a small team.
Yep. Just in general, or working with other people's properties, or communicating.
If I was to hire somebody new.
Yep.
What are the most important traits that you would say lead to a good project?
Yeah. So director-wise, for anything like that, it's communication. first and foremost. If you can have a fantastic art director, but if they can't communicate that to an art team, then they're not actually doing their job. And if they're a bad communicator or they're a lazy communicator, then they're going to actually shoulder more work themselves, which doesn't help anyone. That's, I think, my real thing, is if someone's not communicating well. Outside of that, just having a really broad skill set is great as a creative director or an art director, because you have experience across those things. Art directors in general as well, it's a vision. If they can deliver and communicate that vision, most art directors I've worked with have a background in concept because of that. Some art directors do have a principal 3D background, but they're still very good at that visual communication side of things and making sure that everyone on a team works within that realm. And it's studio scope size. It's having worked on different teams, like a 50-person team, I'd be expecting an art director and an art lead and a creative director. So there's a lot of shared responsibilities across that. Whereas on our current team, we've got an art director, and everyone is involved in everything else. So yeah, it's definitely dependent on those things, because you can also get away with like an art director who, again, if you've got scope to have an art lead, they don't have to be as versed in the implementation or the technical process for it, because you can share responsibilities. So it comes down to team structures in that regard. But yeah, the best art directors I've worked with and creative directors in general have had backgrounds outside of games. I guess that's pretty helpful. Yeah. Yep.
Talking about doing the heavy lifting, and one example that I really liked was the Star Wars wipes and things like that.
Yeah,
It seemed like low-hanging fruit, but in project development might otherwise get pushed back as polish.
Yeah, yeah.
Time that you kind of identify those things and...
Yeah, I think early on, if you can identify that stuff as low-hanging fruit, of like, this is an easy thing, we can do this, it's going to be great, awesome. Every single project I've worked on, and even the current one, is very, very stylized. That's one of the reasons why it looks like a comic book. I haven't announced it yet, but it looks like a comic book game. And so with that, there's like a couple little things. One of it is we've got a line renderer, so all of the world is rendered with black illustrative lines. That does 90% of our visual stuff. But it's also one of the first things we implemented. So yeah, if you can work those things out, sometimes that stuff only comes up later though. So, but if it's later, then it's easy to implement. It's like, sweet, we just got this freebie. So yeah, but yeah, I think that's it. I think we're going to have to move out now. So thank you very much.